I would like to thank the Society and the committee, Scientific Committee, for giving me the opportunity to speak about severe ARDS and what should be done. Now, if you think I'm just going to talk about gadgets and costs, well, you might as well go now. We're going to talk about important things here. Conflicts of interest are disclosed on this. There are no financial conflicts of interest, a couple of academic links. Now, what are we talking about when we talk about severe ARDS? Now, Jean made it easy because he showed the slide which gives you the Berlin definition, and it gives you the different mild, moderate, and severe definitions of ARDS. And you've got the values there with mercury, PEEP, and so on. Now, of course, then you can decide on whether you've got opacities in however many quadrants. That's not the most important point. The important point is that the severity of ARDS is associated with an increase in mortality. And here there are physiological studies which have shown an increase in mortality that were used to validate this, and it was 45% with severe ARDS. And that is with PF ratio less than 100 and PEEP greater than 5. And if you then change the values as you see them here, you can see that you can still use it to predict mortality. In this study, you've got severe ARDS cases. There aren't many, 86 patients out of some 300. And you've got mortality of around 60%. And so you obviously should be telling the patient's family that it's a serious illness. Now, what do we know about? Here we have a large cohort of patients being given mechanical ventilation. This is from John Laffey and Giacomo Bernini. They're the main authors of this global observational study. There were Northern Hemisphere and Southern Hemisphere patients, and the idea was to see what respiratory failure, acute respiratory failure was doing today. These are patients over the age of 16 being given non-invasive ventilation in an intensive care unit, and they have acute respiratory failure and ARDS. And these are the Berlin definitions which were used here. Here you have the preliminary data. These are patients from the Northern Hemisphere. There are around 10,000 patients there, 3,595 with acute respiratory failure, 2,183 with ARDS. And when you look at the patient history here, the patients who didn't have ARDS symptoms at day one, some of them did develop to get mild, moderate, or severe ARDS criteria, and you've up to 380 with the patients out of the 3,000 being given mechanical ventilation. So it's not a large number. It's not the vast majority of the patients we see in our departments. And the percentage we have in the study is around 21%. The risk factors, or pneumonia for most of them, and also for most of the ARDS cases in this study. Now, severity, it's measured here with the surface score, and you can see that for so-called severe ARDS, you have an increase in the extrapulmonary or non-pulmonary surface score. So this is not single organ failure. There's a significant number of these patients who have other failures, and often hemodynamic or kidney failure. When you look at severity for gas exchanges, you've got it here. You can see the PF ratio is around 75, and the worst was around 71, and some of the patients suffering from hypercapnia, as you can see on this slide here. And you can understand when you look at this slide what happens. Well, you obviously have hypoxia, but for a number of these patients, you have hypercapnia with some 27% of the ARDS patients with less than 7.25 pH, and you can see those figures for day 1 there on the graph. So the question is, what do we do? What can we propose to these severe ARDS patients? And I'd say, well, the first thing we should do is to do things properly, to do simple things properly. And perhaps they're not always done as they should be done. Now, I just love this slide here. It comes from the Berlin definition, obviously, and it shows what we should be doing for all ARDS patients and what type of patient can be given what type of intervention. Now, we'll come back to it. If you have only around 6 mL per kilo low tidal volume ventilation, okay, this should be part of standard practice now. You'd like to think so. And the benefit observed was seen regardless of the quartile for the plateau pressure or the severity of the diseases. Patients with severe ARDS probably got greater benefit in terms of reduced mortality, and those who had lower plateau pressure still had a benefit for reduction in mortality when they had 6 mL per kilo ventilation. But this takes time. And here you have a slide which shows you that 8 years ventilation, Mayo Clinic. This is part of this window here. It starts at 10.6 millimeters per kilo, and it takes 8 years to gradually get down to 6.8. And you have the impression that we don't perhaps do that as easily as we do, and it does count. Right? I think this is an excellent study that was published in the BMJ. They classified the patients. Okay, well, it was they were compliant with 6.8 units per kilo or not, and you can see it's around 7.5 for part of the cohort that was not compliant, and 6 for the compliant part of the cohort, in line with the guidelines. But it's interesting to see that 7.5 and 6 are not the same. You don't get the same effects. There's a reduction in the risk of mortality when you go from 7.5 to 6, when you've got 100% adherence. And perhaps it's the most severe cases that shouldn't have too great a discrepancy. Now, I'll come back to this study here in the cohort. Now, what happens? This is what you see in real life. More than 500 centers here, where between 7.5, 8, 7.5 milliliters for the cases that are severe ARDS. When you look at the plateau pressure, 21, 22.9, 25.4, and when you look at the relationship between plateau pressure and tidal volume, you can see that 47 patients are ventilated with VT greater than 7 mils per kilo, and the patient's severity seems to have little influence on the ventilatory settings. And if I say that we could start by looking after basic and simple things, then this should be food for thought. Now, PEEP, we've already seen this. Jean showed us this, and we have the meta-analysis comparing higher PEEP and lower PEEP, and the impact on alveoli. And if there was an ARDS with the ratio at the PF ratio, you've got certain levels that change, but if you've got a PF ratio above 200, it doesn't change. Now, we should always play safe in life. We can go up a bit, but not much. We're still around a PEEP of 10. And if you superimpose this data on the PEEP, which is recommended by the algorithms in the alveoli study for the PF ratio, you don't even get to the level of the most severe patients who need the highest FiO2. and the PEEP, which is recommended with the algorithm in the conventional arm with the low PEEP level. So if you have the right setting for PEEP, then this could have a key impact. And it's interesting to see that patient severity seems to have very little influence on the way we set the ventilation in real life. And when we're there with the patient in real life, the question we need to say is, when I'm going to change the PEEP level, what is it going to do to the arterial oxygenation? Will there be an impact there? What impact will there be on lung recruitment? What impact will there be on lung protection, the reduction of stress and strain? And what will the impact be on hemodynamics? And this is why we rarely go above 10 or 12 in real life. And what about delivery? And you need to go from ready-to-wear to tailor-made settings for the severe ARDS patients. Now, if you look at the volume pressure curve, and I really like this study, it goes back some time now, it's not a recent one, and you look at the dynamics, you've got when you increase the PEEP, the curve tends to get steeper, going up. This is the effect of recruitment. But most have a volume pressure curve which is convex, and when you increase the PEEP, you can see it goes along the x-axis. But this is not recruitment here, it's over-distension. Now, you might think that you could just decide on who's going to reap the benefit of a PEEP on the basis of that, but it's not as simple as it may seem, because when you look at the beneficial effect of PEEP, the benefit on recruitment, as we saw earlier, patients who have a concave curve are those who have a reduction in cardiac output and in oxygen delivery, which is a greater reduction, unfortunately. And when you have an increase, it reduces the shock but increases the PO2, and it has the greatest hemodynamic burden for these patients. So if they've got severe ARDS patients and you increase the PEEP, can you increase the SRLF? Take you reduce the strain and stress for the patients? And then perhaps it could be worthwhile to go for filling. There are all sorts of ways of dealing with these patients. I don't have time to go into the details and to discuss it, but I can agree with Jean de la Monica here. I think it's the most severe patients where we should be looking at the question of transpulmonary pressure.
So returning to the study that he already showed, you take these patients who initially needed to be connected to ECMO, you give them a pressure balloon in the esophagus, you change the settings, particularly for PEEP, and these are quite substantial, 22 here, which is not where you would spontaneously go. And this it goes along with a clear increase in oxygenation. Once you've done all of these things, you can start trying to address the questions of what exactly you can do in addition to that. And the two first things, which I think everyone would agree upon at this point, are QRARs and the prone positioning. You all know the work by Laurent Papazian that shows that a brief period of curare leads to lower mortality, less pneumothorax, and broadly speaking, this is in agreement with the practices. There are other studies that are going to be starting up to try to bear out this work, but it is very clearly something which I think is part of the approach for severe ARDS. You also heard about this from both Claude and Jean, the prone position quite clearly, and there's no need to get into discussions about these things. It's a bit disappointing to look at the results from lung safe, but that will probably take time. Ultimately, curare is about 30%. of the patients, but the prone position, even when you're interested in patients that have severe ARDS, as you can see over here, it's not a very high percentage. Less than 15% of the patients will be put into a prone position. I would imagine that many of you thought I was going to talk about this for 20 minutes. Well, that's not the case. The reason for this is that, once again, I think that it concerns, or should concern, a relatively low number of patients in LungSafe, 7%. And this is no doubt pretty reasonable. So which patients, what kind of results? There are a number of things that have readjusted our view, the available technology, first of all, and secondly, CHICHE. And there's a third factor as well. So for CHICHE, we have this study with patients randomized with ARDS into a hospital that does a lot of ARDS, so they can potentially have ECMO, be treated on location. Those patients who are transferred, you can see that overall 24% will never be connected. Instead, they will be treated with conventional management. They do have to be transferred, which is not neutral, and ultimately they find themselves in an expert center, unlike the other patients. And this stands out at the end of the study with something as simple as ventilation with a tidal volume which is moderate, 90 versus 70%, depending on the group you look at. So that could explain some of the differential in terms of mortality. What CHICHE shows quite clearly is that when you're transferred to a center that sees a lot of ARDS and that has all of the machinery needed, the equipment needed to look after them, you probably have a better chance than if you're being treated in a center where there's relatively little occurrence of ARDS patients. EOLIA is still underway. We don't have the results from this study yet, which should enable us to have further fodder to assess the advantages for severe ARDS patients of ECMO. But meanwhile, we still have a large number of patients who are connected to ECMO and turn up in reports such as that of the ELSO registry report connected for pneumonia with survival rates which are quite impressive, as were the survival rates for patients connected to ECMO for flu in the original Lancet's publication with barely 21%. You know what the ANZUS Australia New Zealand thing context looks like. If you want to move a patient from a real community center to an intensive care unit, you're probably going to be talking about ECMO, so that most of the patients who were connected in that way probably weren't that severe in many cases. And then you have this British study. And once again, they were looking primarily at the statistical analysis and matching with propensity ratings. The proportion of patients who were treated with ECMO for flu who were not referred to an ECMO center, and this showed a significant drop in mortality for ECMO-referred patients. But what we're interested in here is not so much the technical aspect as the transfer to reference teams. And if you look at the REVA cohort in France, you have different results in terms of mortality. No significant difference between those patients who were treated with ECMO and those who were not during the flu epidemic of 2009. That must be H3N2, what I have here. But anyway, they had that in the US. So let's use ECMO, but not too over eagerly. There are some patients, first of all, who can improve without ECMO if we do some things like adjusting PEEP and hemodynamics, and then there are less invasive alternatives, particularly the prone position, which also should remind us that there's no real proof that ECMO is safe. With the new technologies, of course, you might say there are no further problems there. But that was a study where they looked at a long series from 86 to 2006, over a 20-year period, at the factors associated with mortality. One of the factors that stood out was complications while on ECMO. There were some complications that vanished, circuit breaks or coagulation in the circuit, but there were complications that did not disappear. Indeed, some of them are very much present today and have effects. If you look at the British cohort, once again, a number of these patients ultimately die because of complications due directly to ECMO, particularly hemorrhaging. So that severe ARDS does not necessarily mean that we should jump on the ECMO solution, or at least not given how much we know at this point. I like this presentation by Présentation and Heritage that shows a number of indications. Severe hypoxemia is defined here, despite the use of QRARs, prone position, and potentially nitric oxide. And then separately, those patients for which we really cannot keep them within the tidal volume and pressure levels that are deemed reasonable. So when you look at the experience of the Marseille team, you see that a number of patients were referred for ECMO, but again, were not put on ECMO with clinical outcomes, which were quite significant, and a score that enables us to see broadly who is likely or not to benefit from this. There are also some less aggressive techniques that enable you primarily to clear up CO2. There are some clinical cases in the literature that show with a modest series that it's possible to drop the tidal volume even further below 3 mil per kilo, drop the drive-in pressure, and that for these patients it can be possible to achieve higher, faster weaning from mechanical ventilation. In the literature, you have a lot of clinical cases, but there are a few large-scale studies. However, the technology is changing fast. There will soon be a pilot study starting up called Supernova that will be testing specifically for the advantages of ultra-protective ventilation with 3 mil per kilo versus 6 in the treatment of severe ARDS, although we're looking at a population of patients that tend to be moderate to severe rather than severe as such. So that severe ARDS is becoming more of a rare syndrome. I think that appropriate use of PEEP and long sessions of prone position can actually, with appropriate monitoring, improve the outcome in terms of recruitment and oxygenation. It's difficult to carry out clinical trials with these populations of patients because sometimes you're testing things which are very different. It stands out clearly from the CESAR study, and presumably we would be able to do this with high-frequency oscillation. Also, these kinds of techniques, I feel, should be used only in centers that do treat a lot of patients with ARDS, and the management of these patients no doubt calls for more tailor-made than ready-to-wear approaches. Thank you for your attention.
I would like to thank the Society and the committee